Hey everyone, Tactics here, and in this video I'll be talking about the brand new dungeon coming with patch 11.1, Operation Floodgate, which will be immediately joining the Mythic Plus dungeon pool come Season 2. This is not going to be a guide video, as I expect this dungeon will see quite a few changes before the season actually launches, so instead I'll just be giving you my first impressions of the dungeon and giving some feedback on tuning and abilities, which I'll also be posting later on this week for tanks, as well as for the other Season 2 dungeons once they've actually been tested. Don't worry though, I will still be posting all of my dungeon, raid, and tank guide content for Season 2 once we get a bit closer to that launch date, so make sure you are subscribed to the channel for all of those videos. Now, let's start our talk here about the dungeon vibe and layout. This dungeon takes place in a power plant-like area, similar to the area just outside the waterworks delve down in the ringing deeps, and as expected, it does match the Undermine patch theme, being full of mechs, goblins, and of course explosions. In terms of layout, this dungeon starts in a pretty open area where you can opt to go to either of the first two bosses initially, which is nice for flexibility. And then at the same time, you also have to make sure you take 5 weapon stockpiles, which are spread throughout this open area in the dungeon in order to actually spawn the third boss. Kind of similar to Brackenhide in the first area, where you have to open up a certain number of cages in order to actually spawn the first boss there. However, in this case, there are no extra weapon stockpiles anywhere, so you are forced to go to the 5 specific ones that they've placed. So potentially you could add maybe a 6th and 7th one or something in here, just to give players some more flexibility. Once you defeat the third boss, you can head down into the power plant itself, which is pretty linear until you reach the final boss. Overall, big fan of the theme, big fan of the brand new circle ability indicators that it shows off that are also going to be included with the rest of this patch, and we've seen some in the raid, hopefully other dungeons as well. And also big fan of a dungeon that gives you some choice in routing as opposed to pure linear dungeons. That being said, there are of course a few trash mobs that probably are overtuned, which, as expected, first time we're seeing this dungeon, but having overtuned mobs can eliminate any real choice you have, so let's talk about those. Speaking on abilities in general here to start, the dungeon seems to be steering away from having a lot of interrupts, with most mobs having either 0 interruptible abilities or 1 interruptible ability that has a cooldown. There are 2 spam casters, I believe, in the entire dungeon, which I'll be talking about both on this list, so don't worry. But all things considered, the interrupt requirements in this dungeon feel quite low, especially compared to some of the Season 1 dungeons, which is very nice. Starting at the beginning of the dungeon, let's go over some of those problematic abilities that I was alluding to, where in this case, I'm not going to be referring to things that I think are going to feel super dangerous on higher and higher keys towards the Mythic Plus title. Instead, I'm focusing on how abilities feel at that plus 10 key level, something a lot more players are going to be engaging with, and which I was spamming on the PTR. Right at the top of that list, we have the Shredder mobs, the Shreddinator 3000, and they appear all throughout this first area of the dungeon, especially quite early on. And the one ability I would say is the Shreddation one, which basically spawns these blades underneath players. Really cool animation. Love the animation. Love the sound. I think there are a couple things with it. One, the cooldown on it could probably be a little bit longer. It seems to happen very, very frequently. This is going to be a common theme of this dungeon. This area denial happens pretty frequently, forces you to move a lot. It's kind of annoying, the frequency, so a cooldown increase would probably be nice, and also potentially increasing the time before the initial hit of the saw blade activates could also be nice, because right now they just kind of appear and do damage. Give players a bit of time to react. If you're not going to give them time to react, you need to make sure you hit that initial damage down quite a bit. So one or the other. Give it some time to activate or reduce that initial damage by a fair bit. Mecha-drone snipers are also in this first area, and these guys do a lot of random target stuff. They have an interrupt, which is totally fine, has a long cooldown, and they also have a random target shoot ability, and this one seemed like it was a bit too high in terms of the damage it was dealing, because of course it's not avoidable, not interruptible in any way, and they cast this quite frequently, right, because it's kind of their filler ability. So I think the damage here should probably be brought down a little bit just to make it more in line with the other mobs, because as is, this is like a high priority skip mob in my opinion, just because of the amount of random damage it deals, and because a lot of these come in clusters, right? Like 2-3 of these mobs together in one pack that you can't pull less of, and if these ever sync up, Even two on a single player is likely a death. Ventrico Architects, another mob. These guys have kind of a cool ability where they build the scaffolding and climb up out of range of melee abilities, and you can kind of hit them maybe if you jump, but really you have to kill the scaffolding they created to have them fall back down. Kind of really interesting, honestly. I think that's kind of a cool mechanic, using the Z axis a bit more. But they do have this other ability called Nail Gun, which they kind of, again, almost spam. It's not quite a spam. There seems to be gaps between the casts for like three-ish casts. But this is basically like a 3-second bleed route, is my understanding of it. Not a magic. So it can be quite annoying if you pull like a couple of these mobs, which, to be fair, is never forced on you. I don't think there's two of these ever in any packs. There's one, but there's packs that are close together that have one. And it's just the frequency of this route going out on groups, and the fact that it happens in like sets of like three-ish or more is definitely a bit annoying. Potentially either get rid of that route if you wanted to just have this kind of random target damage hit, or just reduce the frequency of the cast. You could also potentially make this a magic effect instead of just I think it is a bleed effect. That's either bleed or physical right now. If you made it a magic effect, it would give people more ways to actually clear that effect from themselves, because it can definitely overlap with some other mobs in the dungeon that require you to move a lot, like we talked about the shredders earlier, and there's a lot of other mobs that create circles you want to avoid. And with the frequency of these routes, it's definitely a very, very annoying mob to play around if you're someone that plays a spec that can't free themselves from routes. Dark Fuse Blood Warpers are one of the spam cast mobs I was talking about. These are also a lieutenant mob, but luckily their spam cast is only into the tank specifically. So they cast these bolts into the tank repeatedly, which you want to interrupt. These bolts, though, hit very, very hard. Like, I think on a +10, these were hitting me for over 10 million damage if a kick was missed. So one, I think even for it being a tank specific hit, the damage is probably a bit high, especially if you consider like uncoordinated groups. They're not going to have a full kick rotation properly set up. Some of those are going to go through probably. And if you're not ready for one to go through, your tank is getting absolutely owned by this cast. So maybe tone the hit down a little bit, or put a small cooldown on the actual cast. Even just a cooldown of like 3-4 seconds would buy you some time to make that kick rotation a bit easier. And the other thing is they also have a pretty nasty AoE that deals the most damage of anything I've seen in this dungeon so far. And again, these guys, in a lot of cases, are not avoidable because a couple of them are guarding some of the actual weapon crates that you need to get. Right, so I think that AoE damage definitely needs to come down a little bit, just because it's the single hardest hitting thing that I can think of in this dungeon so far. But otherwise, I think a lot of the AoE damage seems relatively fair outside of this specific mob. Dark Fuse Inspectors have the surprise inspection ability, where they basically blink to a random player and do a frontal through them, kind of similar to the mobs in City of Threads, in the center area after the first boss, but it's a bit quicker and the cone's a bit smaller. One thing I would say is this happens way too frequently, in my opinion. They're just constantly jumping all over the place, and obviously this can be outplayed by coordinated groups with stacking strategies and stuff like that. But I do think just the frequency of this ability, again, probably a bit too high. You could probably increase the cooldown and it would just feel a lot better. Moving down into the area before the final boss, Dark Fuse Electricians are the other spam caster mob in this dungeon, though in this case they target random players as opposed to the tank. So again, I'm going to recommend either adding a short cooldown to Lightning Bolt or just reducing the damage of the cast. Personally, I prefer the short cooldown. I'm not a huge fan of spam caster mobs, and again, even if you're putting like a 3 to 5 second cooldown on an ability, it still feels way, way, way better than just having a spam caster mob kind of just doing their thing, blasting off, especially in the case of these mobs, where a lot of packs actually force you to pull 2 of these at a time, right? A lot of times you don't have a choice, just because of how these trash packs rather are designed. And if you want to pull 2 packs together, sometimes that means there's 4 of these mobs, which obviously makes that just absolutely impossible to do. So little cooldown here would go a long way. The big lieutenant mobs in this last area are the Dark Fuse Jump Starters, and these guys again have a bit of a frequency issue, kind of similar to the Shredders that we talked about earlier, where they spawn a lot of electric circles on the ground that your group needs to avoid. And I think this just happens a bit too frequently, and kind of like the Electricians, there is a pack where you are forced to pull 2 of these at a time just before the final boss. And, if you're doing that, there are just circles everywhere. You never get a second to breathe. It's very annoying, and there's no way to avoid that in any way, right? So an increased cooldown here would go a long way. That does pretty much cover all the mobs I have issues with, though. But as you can see, the list isn't very long, considering this is the first time that we're seeing this dungeon at all. Plus, the adjustments aren't super significant, right? Some small tuning on reducing some damage of some abilities or increasing the cooldown, and that pretty much covers almost all of the issues I have with the trash. Generally, I'm pretty happy with how things are looking. Moving on to bosses, I actually have even less issues to cover here, as I personally really enjoyed all 4 of the boss fights. Starting with Big Mama, it's just a 2-phase fight where in one phase you have 4 adds on top of the boss, so you get to do big AoE damage, and then in the other phase you take pulsing damage for your healer to deal with while gaining a damage amp on the boss. There's also, of course, stuff like dodging and area denial, but overall, I think it's a really nicely designed fight. On the other side of the map, you've got the dynamic duo fight where you get to flex your cleave muscles, where the core of this fight is just about ensuring no bombs ever detonate on your group, and you can remove this from the arena by using various boss mechanics, which is kind of cool. And of course, you have to do all this while dodging a ton of explosives in true goblin fashion. Had a lot of fun with this one, especially once you figure out all the various abilities you can use, including the charge and the random target circles, to actually clear these bombs from the map. The third boss is Swamp Face, who kind of steals the chain mechanic from Sludge Fist, binding 2 players and pulling them together if they ever move too far apart. This ignores the tank unless someone is dead, so then the tank will get included. And of course, to make this even more fun while you are bound with your buddy, there is a ton of things to dodge, including random target beams, waves, and circles on the ground. So you need to be on the same page as your partner when it comes to avoiding things, which is something I am sure a lot of pugs will love. One thing about this boss, though, that I think could be improved is the animation on the circles you need to avoid specifically. As I've said already a couple times this video, the new circle animation is absolutely amazing, but this ability did not get that kind of glow up, so it's just kind of this brown circle that's not super clear in this brownish water that you're fighting the boss in. So making this just a bit easier to see would definitely be nice. Finally, we've got the last boss in Giesel Gigazap, which again has a ton of stuff to dodge. Common theme in this dungeon, I guess. You got lightning beams, you got falling ceilings, you got water puddles, and also is a fixate mechanic that is definitely inspired by Morchi from Dragonflight, where these lightning orbs are chasing every single player in your group, and you need to kite them into one of those previously mentioned water puddles, which turns them into lightning puddles. Unlike Morchi, these are not like ads, so they can't be attacked. You can't just see them and ignore them, but they do move significantly slower, so you get a lot more time to actually figure out where you want to put these, where you want to kite these to, and it's just generally much more forgiving, assuming you don't remove all of the eligible water puddles by hitting them with some of the other lightning mechanics, which causes them to preemptively turn into those lightning puddles and not allowing them to remove those orbs. Overall, cool fight. I like the first iteration of the dungeon that we're seeing. I think Blizzard did a really good job here putting this out, and all of my critiques are honestly on the small end. So hopefully they take some of the feedback I and other players have given, and we get to see this dungeon launch in a very well balanced state. That is it for this video, though, guys. Let me know what you think of this brand new dungeon coming next season, and make sure you're subscribed for more PTR thoughts, as well as Season 2 guides launching closer to the release of the season. As always, I got to give a massive shout out to all of my amazing Patreon supporters for everything that they do, and I'll see everyone in the next video.